In this video, I'm going to show you how to prepare wood for staining. For the wood to be stained correctly, it needs to be free of all pre-existing finishes. So the first step is, if you have a pre-existing finish, use either a stripper or very rough sandpaper to remove it to bare wood. The next major step is to sand the wood. The level of roughness you end up with will affect how dark the stain appears once you apply it. The higher the grit size you go to, such as 220, the less the stain can absorb into the grains because you've reduced their size so much that very little stain can actually penetrate it. If you go very rough, say 100 grit, they're much wider and a lot of stain will penetrate and it'll appear much darker. Keeping this in mind, I would suggest doing a test piece before, but a good compromise is 150 grit. The grains are still open enough that it'll absorb the stain and appear dark, but it's not so rough that once you apply your first finish, you don't have to knock it down because there's a bunch of rough grains sticking through. So in my case, I'm just going to use 150 grit. If you have brand new wood straight from the factory, it's likely around 100 grit finish, in which case all you need to do is sand it to increasing grits up to 150 grit sandpaper. If you have stripped and or rough sanded the wood to get rid of any finish, you will need to move up in increasing grit sizes all the way to 150. You cannot skip more than 30 to 40 grit sizes, or else you won't get all of the scratches from previous grits. Theirs had an existing finish on it, so what I did is I stripped it with a chemical stripper and then I used a belt sander to level it. It had fairly bad water damage, so this was all curved and non-level, so I leveled it with a belt sander with a 60 grit belt. Then using a random orbit sander, I went up in grit sizes from 60, 80, 100, 120, and then 150. You don't have to do all of these, you could skip a few, so you could go from 60 to 100 or 80 to 120. If you want to get all the scratches from previous grit sizes out, you will have to go up in sequential sizes of no more than around 20. For instance, if I jump from 60 straight to 100, there will still be deep 60 grit scratches left in after the 100. If you're not too worried about surface finish, then this is fine. If you're very concerned with the absolute perfect finish, it's best to only go up in 20 grit sizes or so. Also, if you want the best surface finish, you need to make sure and fill all holes and gouges to get a completely flat surface. I did this after stripping and then belt sanding the stairs. I filled all holes, that way the next step I immediately sanded them flat and it created a flat surface. After sanding with a certain grit size, it's important to vacuum up all dust and debris. If you don't, the particles from a previous sanding disc will still be present on the wood and you'll actually be making more scratches even though you're using a finer grit size. Once you have finished sanding to 150 grit and done a final vacuuming, it's time to remove any remaining dust with either a tack cloth or I'm just going to use a microfiber towel. The small fibers in here are great for picking up the dust particles. As you can see, all the dust particles are captured by these small fibers. The next step is very important. It's called popping the grain, and we're trying to make the grains raise up. This forces them to absorb the stain evenly. So if you have a knot somewhere, there's a high content of resin around it. At that location, the stain won't penetrate the resin as effectively unless you condition it and pop the grains upward. You could buy a conditioner at the store, but in my case, I'm just going to use water. It works the exact same and it's basically free. So all you need to do is spray your towel. I'm just using a microfiber towel. You could use a t-shirt or whatever you have. And I'm going to spray the wood. The goal here is not to get it soaking wet. We're just going to wipe it and it should be very moist, almost to the point of sitting water, but not quite. It's very important that you put the water on completely even. If there's one spot that has a lot of water or no water, it'll be very obvious because the stain will not penetrate it evenly in that spot compared to everywhere else. After you have conditioned the wood, you need to let it completely dry. During the drying process, the grains will raise up. Avoid stepping on the wood at this point because you'll crush the grains back down. Once the wood has completely dried, it's time to move on to applying the stain.